And we have one last guest for today, David
Good
Hundeyin.
afternoon.
Did I get that right? David
No, you did not.
Hundeyin. Hundeyin.
Hundeyin, that's fine.
Hundeyin. Okay, it's the A, not an E. Hundeyin. Hundeyin. I need to write that down phonetically. He is investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, and is the 2023 James Carey Fellow at Cambridge University. David, thanks for joining me, man. How you doing this morning? Well, wait a minute. Where are you located around the globe, by the way?
I'm somewhere on the African continent.
Okay.
That's as far as that's as much as I will disclose.
Fair enough. I accept that. I do accept that. I was only asking for time zone reasons. I don't know if it's
Yeah,
evening or morning where you are. Okay.
it's afternoon. Sorry.
Okay. Afternoon. Okay. Fair enough. It's nighttime here, and so I have
Oh,
no idea. The time zones are always a pain in my ass. No, man. Thank you for joining me. You doing okay this afternoon?
yeah.
Okay. I want let's learn some about Africa. Fair enough. I was looking at some of the stories that were bubbling up on the continent. And one of the stories I think we hit last time had to do with China's influence and Russia's influence in Africa. What is the U.S. influence? I mean, they have things like AFRICOM. They have things like they build military bases and those type of things. One of my guests had this book where she was talking about the way in which the U.S. was operating in Africa and those type of items. Is it just military bases? Is it just subversive tactics? Like, what is our role in the way that we engage with the African continent?
So if you're familiar with something called the whole of society approach, which is very much an American creation, it's an American concept, where for lack of a better term, you could describe it as a refined, turbocharged form of colonialism, where essentially the entirety of a society at every level, is hijacked or weaponized to suit American goals. So that may not necessarily mean conflict, but it means that at every level of society, the society is not working primarily toward the goals of its own interests, but toward the interests of the U.S. government. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to speak for the whole of Africa. I'm going to speak for Nigeria, which is like a microcosm of Africa. Obviously, it's the largest, most populated country in Africa. The techniques used here are scaled across the continent. So,
Mhm.
um, for example, the media and civil society space in Nigeria, which you may or may not know, is almost entirely dominated by US interests and to a lesser extent British and European interests, but mostly US interests. So the so-called independent media, right, the big independent online platforms, when you check the funding, you see names like Ford Foundation, you see names like
Interesting.
MacArthur Foundation, you see names like the Open Society Foundation, you see names like the Media Network, you see names like the Gates Foundation, you see names like the Rockefeller Foundation,
Yeah.
which all these names I've just mentioned, I don't think it's quite well known, basically, that these are all essentially U.S. intelligence fronts,
Right.
without exception. These entities control the entirety of Nigeria's civil society space and a very large portion of its information space. Um, and it's not just sort of under the table, subtle stuff. Sometimes it's a lot more open and aggressive. So if you look through the WikiLeaks cables, which is one of my favorite things to do, by the way, I just sometimes go to the WikiLeaks database and just type the keyword Nigeria and just what new thing am I going to discover this time?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I discovered last year was this was a cable that was published sometime in 2000, that was sent in 2007, and I have no reason to doubt that such programs still exist now. And it was essentially a staffer at the U.S. Embassy writing a cable to the State Department and boasting that a Nigerian journalist working at the state-owned radio station in Nigeria, Voice of Nigeria, um, had been essentially captured by the US State Department. So the journalist was described in the cable as State Department sponsored journalist Buhari Awo.
Really?
Yeah. So apparently this guy had been given money, he'd been given inducements, he had been given a visa to visit the US. He had an all expenses paid trip to Washington D.C., which, as you can imagine, might be a big deal for someone who was born in Kaduna and has probably never left, probably doesn't have a passport, he's probably never left Nigeria before. All of a sudden, this foreign government is coming in and whining and dining him, on the other side of the planet. So that's a very big deal. And as a result of that partnership, they said that apparently in that instance, the goal of that partnership was to get him to influence the coverage on Voice of Nigeria of the U.S. government, basically to create positive coverage of the US government and its policies, particularly toward Muslims. And the context then was obviously northern Nigeria is heavily dominated by Muslims. And in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks and then the
Hmm.
resultant wars in the Middle East, there was a lot of anti American sentiment in northern Nigeria. So his job was basically to roll back the tide of that sentiment by creating sort of, for lack of a better term, pro US propaganda, which he did. And the only reason we're talking about this is because some staffer in the U.S. embassy happened to boast about it in a cable. So how many thousands of times have such things happened in Nigeria's information
Yeah.
space that didn't go into a diplomatic cable and no one knows about them? So so it's individual journalists, it's entire media platforms, it's even the regulation and the legal frameworks that govern not just the information space, but other spaces like healthcare, like agriculture.
Mm.
It's very often the case that these very actors, these what people call NGOs, but which are really a sort of shadow government, really, because these entities are sometimes even more powerful than an actual state. These entities have direct access to everybody in power in Nigeria. So there was a video report that I did a few weeks ago. This was focused on the food space, right? But
Mhm.
this is emblematic of something else that happens across the Nigerian regulatory space. So during the National Assembly's open week, there was supposed to be a public engagement, a stakeholder engagement session regarding food law in Nigeria.
Okay. Like Big
And
Ag and those
essentially,
type of things.
yeah. So the idea of the idea behind the session supposedly was, now that there's this whole debate about whether GMOs should be approved or should not be approved, there should be a public discussion. Stakeholders from all parts of the food value chain and the regulators should sit around a table and have an honest conversation about this, which will obviously influence policy, which sounds like a great idea.
Right.
But then, so I got hold of the program that had the list of people who were who made up the people on that table. So there were 9 people. 2 of them were senators, so lawmakers, and the other 7 were people from private institutions, from supposedly representing farmers, representing the biotech industry, representing consumers, representing the different parts of the stakeholder circle, right? And what I was able to establish by simply digging into the background, this didn't take a lot of research, by the way. This took like 30 seconds of research in each case. And I was able to establish that those 7 people who were supposedly stakeholders having an honest conversation about food policy in Nigeria, every single one of them worked for an entity that was directly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Are you serious?
Yes. So essentially, that was not public debate at all. That was an astroturfed, scripted conversation with a defined endpoint, it, with a predetermined endpoint in mind, which is obviously that GMOs are safe, GMOs are fine. Please approve them in Nigeria. There's no problem with them because obviously Bill Gates has a financial interest in pushing GMOs, especially
Right.
on parts of the world which have sort of weaker regulatory environments like Nigeria and Africa. So if that has been done in the food space, imagine the similar things that have happened in the health space. Imagine the similar things. I remember the last time we had a conversation and I spoke about how there was a constitutional amendment that was being proposed,
Hmm.
where citizenship by investment program, which nobody asked for and which makes no sense in the context of Nigeria, was suddenly being pushed into law for no apparent reason. These are the things that happen in the background. And when you do some digging, it shows up almost without fail that there's always an American entity behind it. More often than not, it's not the U.S. embassy like directly, but it's one
So
of
NGO.
these shadow institutions. So there's this what I find particularly insidious and dismaying about it is that they've perfected this art of this thing called plausible deniability,
Hmm.
where you are the protagonist, but you've created this veil around you. So the Ford Foundation is the name that you see there. The Gates Foundation is the name that you see there. The MacArthur Foundation is the name that you see there. The Open Society Foundation is the name you see there. To most people, these are just charitable organizations. These are just,
Right.
what's the word, non-profit
Right.
charities, non-organizations. In reality, first of all, these are not non-governmental organizations at all because they're very, very governmental, right? They're funded by the government, right? So if you're familiar with what the former State Department official Mike Pence refers to as a GONGO, as government organized NGO, that's what these organizations actually are. So they're not charitable, they're not non-governmental, and they're not benign. They all have economic and political
Agendas.
uh, agendas that they're tasked with pursuing. But most people do not know this. So I that is a challenge I have run to in the course of even trying to educate the public about the shared danger that exists where your regulatory space and your information space, which I think are the two most important spaces in the public life of a country,
Okay.
those spaces are being dominated by a foreign government. And most people don't understand
Wow.
that this is a foreign government. Most people just see it as an NGO. An NGO is just this abstract thing that's just hanging in the air without context to most people, right? Most people don't understand, especially in this part of the world where there's this idea that charity is a thing. So you are coming from America, so the culture you exist in, you are probably more cognizant of the fact that charity isn't really a thing.
Hmm.
Nothing really goes for nothing. There's
Right.
always a string
Strings
attached
attached.
somewhere.
Yeah.
But culturally, in this part of the world, the level of awareness is not the same because culturally there
Interesting.
is the concept of just abstract charity is very much a thing. So when someone like me or plenty of other people in my space try to raise the alarm and raise the issue that these charities, these NGOs are not benign. They're not looking to act in your best interest. They're not trying to do good for you. They're not trying to make the world a better place. They're simply pursuing specific political and economic agendas. People don't understand it,
They don't see it.
right? So, yeah, so that actually is where I think the US government has perfected this art of hiding behind a fig leaf and sort of carrying out all sorts of economic and political agendas in other people's countries in plain sight, and partly because culturally people are not used to or familiar with that level of deviousness, so they don't even know what they're looking at. They don't realize what they're dealing with
Interesting.
and the danger that it represents, and also because these are very, very, very well funded and very generous organizations. So it's well known in the Nigerian information space, for example, that if you're trying to make a good living, for example, as a journalist, then you want to work in and around one of these sort of NGO funded newsrooms. You don't want to work with a legacy newsroom because everybody knows there's no money there.
Hmm.
Those guys mostly make their money either from government or the little advertising revenue there is to be had. You and I know that advertising revenue doesn't really run media because advertising
No,
revenue doesn't make a
it
dent
doesn't.
in the
Uh-uh.
budget. It doesn't do anything. So those guys are poor basically. So if you're a young journalist and you have ambition, you want to live in a nice place, you want to buy a car, maybe you want to get married someday, have a family, you know that there's really no future for you with the legacy media. So you're looking toward the newish online stuff, which is almost entirely US funded. So
Interesting.
knowing that this is where your bread is buttered, it's very unlikely. Even if you eventually figure out that you are acting on behalf of someone else's geopolitical interests, which may not be in your country's interest, even if you eventually figure that out, the calculation that many people, including people that I know, have made is that, well, I didn't create this situation. I'm just one person. I'm just trying to survive. This world is much bigger than me, and this is just a system
Yeah.
that exists. So what can
And if
I
I
do?
don't do it, somebody else will do it.
I'm exactly, exactly. So
Yeah.
I'm just trying to take care of my family. So it's not. Um, I'm going to strategically close my eyes to this and pretend not to be aware of what I'm doing and who I'm helping.
Interesting. I'm curious. How does one of the most interesting things to me, the Sahel states, do you see them, because they've broken that model? I mean, they've fundamentally broken that model. I mean,
Hmm.
and Traoré talks about it all the time. This idea that we need to be able to control our information space. We need to be able to control how our countries, how we see ourselves. Like we can't look at ourselves through the lens of, let's say, a Western government. We need to see ourselves through our own lens,
Exactly.
through our own experience. Do you see that being infectious to the rest of Africa? I mean, those states have effectively tried a new model. And if that model works, is that something that you see propagating? Has it had influence on other parts of Africa beyond the West Africa?
Um, so in terms of the information strategy of the Sahel states, I don't think it's had that influence yet. And the simple reason is
Okay.
that the other side is still a lot more resourced. There's still a lot more money on the other side. So the other side is still able to scream its narrative much louder than the Sahelians can. So maybe internally they've been able to control their information space, but what they've not been able
Mhm.
to do successfully is project that internationally. So you still have your Western narratives still being trumpeted across the region almost by force. So um, it's got to the point now where they're actually going through the supposedly local actors, these NGO funded media, specifically in Nigeria, are
Mhm.
being used almost on a weekly basis. There's a new hit piece coming out about the Sahel, right? And you can tell that
Really?
even though it's a Nigerian, yeah, even though it's a Nigerian name on the article, you can tell that this wasn't this person's idea. Because some of these people, I know them in person, and I know that you didn't really write this article. And if you did so under
Wait,
duress.
wait, wait.
You were asked,
Are you telling me that they would have, let's say, Bob Cobb's name on it? And it's like, I know Bob Cobb. Bob Cobb would have never
yeah,
written this article. Wow.
yeah, this person actually admires Ibrahim Traoré. I know this colloquially. However, this person is writing this article where he's describing him as this horrible dictator. There's an atmosphere of fear in Burkina Faso, and yada. And I know that this was not of your own originality. Somebody made you do this, and you're probably doing this to keep the lights on at home. You're probably doing this to pay the bills, pay your children's school fees. I mean, I'm not. I'm going to be honest enough and say I don't respect it because I
Yeah.
still believe that no matter what, you have a choice. But I understand why people do those things. But the point is, for the time being, those things are still happening because if you like, the imperialist persuasion still has a lot more money and reach than the Sahelians. When that will change is when the Sahelian countries. I mean, it started happening, but not. It hasn't reached
Mhm.
that critical mass yet. When it will change, when the Sahelian countries start being sort of unignorable in terms of their physical development, in terms of
I see.
people visit and they're like, okay, this place is just way much nicer than where I'm coming from. So if you take a flight from Lagos to Ouagadougou and you're like, wow, these people are just living way better. This is a much better structured system. This is a much healthier society, and these people have a
Deniability.
better way of doing things than we do. When that starts to happen, the sort of word of mouth virality is much more powerful than whatever media narrative can be trumpeted and parachuted in from Washington D.C. So I think
Mhm.
again that's a problem that time will solve. Right now, they haven't reached that critical mass yet. Because, for example, in the case of Burkina Faso, they're basically constructing a country from scratch.
Right.
Like they're basically building the entire infrastructure country, the infrastructure stock of a country from scratch. So I think it's going to be another 5 to 7 years before the benefits of all the things that are being done now will start compounding. Um, but I think it will happen. It's just that it's not going to be sort of short term and visually spectacular event. It's going to be sort of a slow burner. But when it happens, and it's going to be irreversible.
But the other countries have to see that A, they're taking control of their resources. B, they're
Mm,
using those resources for the betterment of their own population.
mm,
And C, in comparison, those countries don't have control in the way that the Sahel states have
mm.
control. Like, I'm not saying the states are looking at themselves to say, hey, we need to have an overthrow of the government, but the populations have to be able to see that and say to themselves, maybe there's a better way to do this. Meaning, if Africa wants, as a continent, wants to, let's say, regain control of itself, that on some level, they're going to have to deal with that monster of a democratic system
Yeah.
that is imposed in order to
Yes.
create a more authoritarian system, despite the fig leaf of democracy.
Exactly. Exactly. But what you need to understand about most African countries, and I can definitely speak from a place of authority here, is that part of this long-term project of exerting control over the information and civil society spaces in those countries is that there has been this social conditioning and social engineering that
Mm.
has made people fundamentally question whether even the concept of sovereignty and control is even necessary. Right? There've been
Whoa.
a lot of these
Are you serious?
parachuted narratives. Yes. So there have been a lot of these narratives parachuted in from DC and from London and from Paris that essentially anyone who is any African leader who is talking about sovereignty, resource nationalism, yeah, regaining control, taking a greater share of natural resource revenues from foreign mining entities and all of that, that somehow those are the discussions of a banana republic. Somehow those are things to be looked down on. That if you want to be thought of as modern and forward looking in the sort of approved Western, intellectual sense,
Yeah.
then you should be talking about things that maybe things like AI, things that in your reality are basically abstract, right? Because when you come from a country where 40% of school children don't have access to an all weather road,
Hmm.
30 something percent of the population has never had electricity before, and the electricity that exists is very unreliable, and it's like 6,000 megawatts for 200 million people. When you come from that kind of from that kind of country, the problems that you have are fundamentally not the problems that someone from Switzerland has, but they
I see.
want you to think like you are someone from Switzerland,
I
right?
see.
So you get rewarded for behaving as though for thinking and behaving as though you live in a different place to where you actually live, as though you exist in different contexts to the one you actually exist in. So people who talk about the issues that actually matter, their voices get sort of, suppressed. If you're working in the information space, which I think like the information space is central to all of this, because even the civil society space um, works hand in glove with the information space to spread these narratives. When I say information space, I'm not just referring to journalism. I'm referring to
Mhm.
social media. I'm referring to pop culture, all kinds of things that
Yeah.
shape culture in the country. There's been this effort over decades to sort of marginalize the importance of those things that you just described. So, for example, in 2023, when the coup took place in Niger, and the new government of General Abdurrahman Chiani started talking about um, how France has been mining uranium in Niger for over 40 years, and
Hmm.
Niger still has like 20 something percent of the population that has access to electricity. It's one of the least electrified places in the world,
Yeah.
and at the time was the second poorest country in the world by GDP. So when he was talking about these things, like the reaction from the Nigerian intelligentsia And the West African intelligentsia was, oh my God, one of these, you know, one of these Kwame Nkrumah Pan-Africanist types. Oh dear Lord,
Are you
it's kind of,
serious?
yeah, you get this sort
Plants
of
was
eye rolling
raping
reaction.
Niger
Oh,
blind.
and
I mean, like they
yeah,
were
and
what they
that
were paying like
that
$2 or something insane.
yeah, yeah, exactly. They were getting robbed, absolutely robbed. But the intellectual paradigm that has been imposed on the West African or the African intelligentsia is that you're not supposed to think about that. That's not a problem for you to worry about. No, you should worry about abstract things. Talk about gay rights, right? Like people's kids don't have food to eat, but talk about transgender rights. You know, attend conferences in Berlin with your European friends and talk as if you exist in the same context that they do. Talk as if you share the same problems, which you absolutely do not, right? But basically, disconnect yourself from your own reality and plug yourself into a European or an American abstraction, and you'll be rewarded for that.
Interesting.
So if you consciously decide to focus on your actual problems, the actual problems that face your society, and this was an experience that I had. Um, I'm not proud of this, but I'll just put it out there because there was a point I was actually captured, not financially but intellectually, by that idea that somehow Africa has transcended those conversations. Somehow Africa is supposed to be talking about these other things, talking about the fourth and fifth industrial revolution when you've not had the third industrial revolution yet.
Yeah.
Talking about AI revolution and basically trying to show the world that you exist at the same intellectual level that they do, as though you get a cookie or a pat on the head for that. I was once captured by that paradigm. As recently as 2020, I delivered a TED talk. I was living in Nigeria at the time,
Yeah.
a TEDx talk, and in that TED talk, my premise was essentially that Africa needs to stop talking about resources. Africa needs to do away with the concept of resource nationalism. That Africa's resources are not really as important as we think they are to the world. That essentially African people need to for I'm going to sort of sum it up very crudely because I said a lot more than this, but essentially a boiled down version of what I was saying was everybody should go learn to code, right? Which
Interesting.
in hindsight, like
Don't be programmed.
I've actually tried to get that talk taken down because I'm so ashamed of it now in hindsight because looking at I feel so much embarrassment at how intellectually captured I was at the time that
Uh,
I was sitting in the middle of a city of 21 million people. That's Lagos, the largest city in Africa, and I was getting roughly 6 hours of electricity a day. Right? If you stepped out of where I lived and you walked for 15 minutes, you'd see a slum, like the most stereotypical African slum with incredible, mind-bending poverty. And I wasn't looking at those things as the issues I should be worried about. And I was rather, trying to appeal, I guess, to a European audience, like, oh, African resources and all that. African resource nationalism isn't a thing that Africans should be concerned about. It's an idea from the 50s. It's an independence era idea. It's been 60 years since independence. We're supposed to have moved on,
right.
and these are narratives that have been very deliberately pushed on the African intelligentsia. That the fact that it's been 60 years since independence somehow means that fundamentally something has changed and Africa has moved on and things are different now. They categorically are not. Nothing has changed. The economic dynamic that existed in 1960 still exists today. The
Mhm.
only difference is we have TikTok, right, to to talk about it
TikTok.
on. Fundamentally, the economic and political dynamics that make Africa what it is have not changed at all since the 19th century. So I guess it takes, I guess you need to have a sort of come to Jesus moment, like a wake up moment, like I had, when you eventually start to question some of your more sort of foundational assumptions,
Yeah.
right? So when I started to fundamentally question these assumptions was when um, Well, there were several times when I had these moments, but for me, one of my biggest moments was when I happened to speak to a someone who is involved in the commodities business, shall we say, in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Mhm.
And the things I heard were in direct conflict with every assumption that I had, because the
Okay.
assumptions I had were that the problems in DR Congo were basically driven by greedy African warlords who were trying to profit off of minerals. And it's like they were looking for easy money, basically. That's the narrative I had been fed. That was the easy thing. And this person I was speaking to, who, by the way, happens to be American, made it very clear that the actual warlords, the locals in DR Congo, they don't really know what's going on and they're not part of the game. There's a huge international, for lack of a better term, conspiracy to ensure that DR Congo forever remains mired in conflict. And such and such and such is what is happening. So and so and so is where this is. I was stunned to find out, for example, that there's a city called Kivu in the
Mhm.
eastern DRC, right? Kivu is by GDP, by it's a very poor place. It's not, there's nothing. Sorry, not Kivu. Kivu is the name of the region. The city is called Goma, right? Goma is a poor city. There's nothing spectacular about it. Apparently, Goma has the busiest airspace on the entire continent of Africa. Why would
Really?
this unspectacular mid-sized city that just so happens to be located next to a mining hotspot where every kind of desirable mineral in existence can be found, why does this place have the busiest airspace in Africa? And then
What
you
is
do some more digging into it and you discover that most of these aircraft, they're not, you can't even track them. Some of them, they fly with their transponders off. Why would an aircraft do that? And little by little, you start to realize the enormity of what you're actually looking at. That the curated version of reality that has been fed to you by the sort of Western controlled information space that has been imposed on you is fundamentally not true at all. And that if you want to know the reality of what is happening, even on your continent, you have to go out into the field and actually talk to people, take pictures, do actual journalism work. You can't just sit in front of a computer and read World Bank reports, because a lot of
No.
what is written there is complete nonsense.
Wow. David, that is fascinating. Like, I got to be honest. This is like, I don't know if the audience knows the stuff, and that's why I enjoy these conversations, because it's illuminating. It fills us in on a context that there's no way for us to have because we don't live in the region.
Yeah.
Wow, David, you're fantastic. Um, I swear to God, man, my mind is blown every time we have a conversation, and it makes me realize how much more we should be having conversations about what's going on. And personally, I like to talk about everywhere in the world. But these conversations are fascinating. And some of this stuff I would have just never known. Like, I know that we try to control information space in other countries.
Mm.
The degree to which we have that level of influence and control in this kind of naked, hegemonic way is just mind
Yeah.
blowing. The way cultivating minds.
Academia as well.
Yeah. Brian Berletic hits this too, where Brian Berletic talks about this notion of controlling information space and how um, you can have all the weapons in the world, but if you have a country that doesn't want to use them, or that is catering to an
Exactly.
interest that is not in their own best interest, then the weapons are not really going to matter. You have to be able to control what the public thinks, especially about itself. Wow, David, thank you for this. I always appreciate these conversations. I really do. David Hundeyin. I want to make
Yeah.
sure I got that right. I don't want to fuck. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Yeah. You did. You did.
Okay, David Hundeyin. He is investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, and the 2023 James Curry Fellow at Cambridge University. Dude, like I said, I'm illuminated every time we talk. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
You be safe. Thanks.
All right.
All right. We have come to the end.